But that's interesting because that makes sense for Augustine to think that, but that also makes sense for Pope Sylvester II in the year 1000 to say, "Oh my God, it's about to be over. It's been 1,000 years since Christ. We have like 30 years left." So, how do people deal with that after it comes? It doesn't. So do they reinterpret it after that? Like you mentioned, how it's still in the year 1800, they still think this way, but that's almost 2,000 years now. Like, what's going on with the thousand? You know, that's what I'm trying to get at.
There was a book written some years ago that argued that this whole Sylvester 1000 thing wasn't a big deal. That is on the margins. And there definitely were people who thought it was going to end possibly then.
Yeah.
The big date actually was the year 1260. Who would have thought? But the year 1260 was chosen as the year it was going to end. And then, but different people have picked different years. Of course, 1848 was a very big year. 1988 was supposed to be a big year. And so when I say that this was the interpretation of most theologians, when I say most theologians, I don't mean every Bible reader. There were people who thought, it's predicting now. But the vast majority of people at the time thought that the millennium is not a future event that's going to happen. It's something that's happening now in the church. And the thing that's going to happen is that Christ is going to come back at some point and destroy his enemies, and that'll be that. So there developed the idea. What happens in the 1830s that I've mentioned is the idea that there's something that was called pre-millennialism, which is that Christ comes back before the millennium, rather than he comes back after the millennium. In St. Augustine's view, if this is the millennium, when Christ comes back, it's the millennium's over. But this view started developing that he's coming back before the millennium in judgment. And so that became a pre-millennial view, which is the view that most fundamentalists have today.
You mentioned 1260. This is a time period where the Mongols are. This is the 13th century. The Mongols are huge. You have the Holy Roman Empire. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the church is after the Crusades, and the church has started saying, all right, maybe Islam is just going to keep Jerusalem now. Why is this year so important for the end of the time? Is there a mathematical thing happening, or is it because of the events happening?
It's hard to tell how much the events were affecting the thinking. The thinking was actually started by one person, Joachim of Fiore, whom I discuss in the book, who came to think it wasn't connected with Jerusalem or the Mongols or Muslims or anything like that. It had to do with his own theological view, which was that he believed in the Trinity, and he thought that since God created the world, that the world was organized in three periods, that the Trinity was written into the history of Earth. And so the periods are the Father, and the period of the Son, and the period of the Spirit. The period of the Father was all of time up to from Abraham, when God chose Abraham to be the leader of the future people. From the time of Abraham, the father of the Jews, up to Jesus was the period of the Father. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, the period of the Father, in Matthew has this thing where there are generations between Abraham and David in the Babylonian captivity, and the Babylonian captivity in Jesus, and each of these is separated by 14 generations. And so if you count up the 14 generations, it's 42 generations, and Joachim thought that each generation was 30 years. And so the period between God and Jesus was 1260 years. Well, if that's the period of the Father, how long is the period of the Son going to be? Probably 1260 years. And so followers of Joachim of Fiore worked out that the period of Christ then will end in 1260.